Violence in video games, does it make people violent? Now this is a subject that I've actually wanted to talk about for some time now, and I just got the inspiration to do so from watching a Rebecca Watson video that was recently uploaded, where she was talking about this same issue, and there's data that supports that there is, data that supports that there isn't. And then the way I see it is that people take one side or the other, and then they just negate the data from the other side. And then there's the unfortunate guy who sits on the fence and says, well, it's more complicated than that, and then writes up a bunch of theorems and in this situation and that situation. One of the things her video did point out was that it made certain people violent who had certain personality traits, and that the violence in the video games made people with these particular personality traits violent. Now what we're looking for is what triggers those particular personality traits. To do this, we look at an area of Marxist study called social alienation, how people become alienated from each other, which does breed, among other things, antisocial behavior, violence, general sociopathy, and stuff like that. Essentially, this goes back to a lot of what I said in the, all sex is not rape video, where you have the base and the superstructure. The base is the mode of production society goes through: feudalism, capitalism, communism, tribal society, primitive accumulation, whatever. That mode of production influences the social relations that come out of it, and those social relations can in turn affect that mode of production, meaning a dialectical relationship. But the largely determining factor is the mode of production. And as we've seen commodification increase from primitive accumulation to feudalism to capitalism, our lives have become more and more commodified, meaning we express our relationships with each other more to a greater and greater degree through commodities. And I'm not just, saying this in terms of like, oh, we just text each other now instead of talking. I mean in terms of the mode of production itself. We don't see people that we don't see other human beings, we see people that we work with. People who are in a higher social class, people who are in a different position in the division of labor in the workforce. We no longer see regular people. We don't see the third world worker that gets basically worked to death in various dangerous conditions and the super exploitation that comes out of that. Thus, we don't identify with those people. We don't see them as being us. We don't even see how the person behind the register at a store is even, a person like us. Our relationship, our connection with that person is through the exchange of commodities. And this gets into all kinds of things like otaku culture. It gets into like people who identify with like a particular TV show, or whose only socialization comes like from Magic the Gathering or something. Those personal relationships are expressed only through that particular commodity. Now I'm explaining, alienation in a very brief sense. It's not going too deep because that would be something for like another entire video. Now, when we become more and more alienated from each other, we end up in a situation where we don't identify with each other. And this alienation from each other causes those kinds of personality traits that are triggered by violence in video games. The violence in video games, movies, TVs, whatever, is what's called operant conditioning, meaning it programs it, it puts the idea in our head, and then enough of it, the more you have it, the more it's a problem, and so on. But we see that these personality traits that make this, a problem stem from these social relations, the superstructure that comes from the base, meaning the mode of production of society. So that while we do acknowledge that video games can make people violent, that only comes as a result of the social alienation people feel as a result of the productive relations of, in our case, capitalism. This could also apply to feudalism, but there weren't video games in the feudal era, though we actually would be able to see the same kind of thing. So when we say video games cause violence, what we are seeing is that the operant conditioning that is coming out of video games are feeding off of those particular personality traits that come out of the social structure, the superstructure that come from the base of society. Which means if we were to go on to another mode of production, meaning communism, where our relationships with each other are not commodity relations and that we actually feel that connection to other people again, these personality traits would disappear. Of course, there would always be that, 0.03% of the population that just have it genetically written in. But we have tons of studies, even studies confirmed by Venus Project people, that show that these things are not inherently a problem. They are triggered by social ills. We eliminate those social ills. We end social alienation. Violent video games won't have that effect. Video games, generally speaking, are not the problem. The problem is our social relations, the social alienation we feel from each other. And the violence that comes out of those video games feeds off of that. If we want a society where violent video games won't be a problem, well, essentially we're going to have to abolish capitalism. Because that is what is causing them. The more commodified a society becomes, and the more capitalistic a society becomes, the worse that social alienation is. Look at the extreme ends of suicide in Japan. That society has become highly commodified, even to like really disgusting, inhuman levels, where just cuddling with somebody is something that you buy. I mean, it's sick. That's, commodification taken to a ridiculous extreme. And it can manifest itself in other ways too. It's not necessarily violence. Violence can be carried out on the self too. Which is why we see less of this in the countries which are more highly social. But again, that's going into a whole other thing that there's not time for in this video. Video games are not violent. Video games do not make us violent. The violence plays off of our poisonous social relations that we suffer as a result of capitalism. Once we actually got to communism, it is not so much that violent video games wouldn't have this effect, but we probably wouldn't even want to play them anymore, which would have a double benefit effect. We wouldn't want to play them, and those that did wouldn't be affected by it. And this is a problem that so many people fall into. They can't understand why there's some situations where it does cause violence and other situations where it doesn't cause violence. Because they can't see the social relations that lie behind it, because they must reject the materialist dialectic worldview. They must reject the fact that our social relations are determined by the base, the mode of production that our society is in. And that's why in the end, they can never really understand whether or not video games really make us violent. Our social relations with each other make us violent. And that stems from our base, our mode of production. And in this society, that is capitalism. Thank you for watching. Please comment and rate the video. If you liked it, hit subscribe or check out some of these other great videos. If you wish, share it on social media. While you're at it, why don't you follow me on Twitter? And if you got time, go on over to the MRN bookstore and check out some of the latest books available.